Hello there, I'm Rick Partlow. Welcome back to How to Write Science Fiction That Doesn't Suck. I know it's been a while since I put up a new video. I apologize. I had lots of real world stuff going down, including we sold our house and we're trying to get the deal done on a house to move into out of state, which is a nightmare. Let me tell you. Also, I have six books that I owe to different publishers, and I'm working on 2 of them at a time, and that is pretty much taking up all my time. So I haven't had the chance to record something, but I wanted to while I have a second, and I wanted to do something on plotting out a series. I've been asked several times by several different people, do I plot out my series arcs ahead of time, or do I just, write one book and then plot out the other? Well, when I originally started, I was a pantser, a seat of the pantser, discovery writer, writing into the dark, whatever you want to call it. So obviously I didn't do an outline of my series arc because I didn't do an outline of the book that I was writing. So I wrote each book in the beginning as if it was a standalone and left room at the end for more stories from those characters. So Duty, Honor, Planet, and Birthright, both of those books were pantsed, and I ended them telling a story that had an end at the end of that story, and if I wanted to, I could come back to those characters, and I did. When I wrote book 2, I still didn't have a firm idea of what book 3 would be, but I left some open threads, some open arcs that I could close up in the next book. I wasn't sure at all how I was going to do that, but I wanted to leave something there for the readers. And there's a reason that I did it that way, and it was a very trad publishing way of thinking. In trad publishing, originally, back before people like Jim Butcher and Laurel K. Hamilton and the people who write long series with the same characters, back before then, long series were the exception, not the rule. And a lot of times, if an author wrote 2 books, he wasn't guaranteed a 3rd book. He wasn't even guaranteed a 2nd book. If his first book didn't sell well enough, they might have paid him for the 2nd book, but they might not release it. So I was very wary back in the trad publishing days of books that did not wrap up the story in that book. I felt like a lot of times when they ended on a cliffhanger and then never got another book, then you were cheated out of the end of the story. There was a few, especially urban fantasies in the 90s, back when urban fantasy was really coming on big, that they ended and they never had another book come out because the last one didn't make enough money and the story never finished. And I was ticked, and I did not want to do that to my readers, So even though I was self-publishing, indie publishing, when I started out in 2011, I didn't want to have a book that would be out there and the readers be hesitant to read it because they didn't know if it closed up in one book or if they had to trust me to write another one. Now, as it turned out, that was probably a mistake in a lot of ways, because self-publishing, indie publishing, which was what I started out doing mostly, you can write however many you want. And honestly, a lot of readers are hesitant to start a series unless you have gotten at least 3 books out in it, because they don't want to be burned. So it behooves you to write series arcs, like to have a plan for your series. Now, as I said, I started out not doing this, and in Duty, Honor, Planet, I wrote 3 books, and each one was a story that was closed up in itself, But in the second one, I left more open plot threads to finish in the third, and the third was it. At the time, I didn't like doing more than trilogies, and there was a reason for that. It was also from trad publishing days and being a reader in those days. Was each of these books was set a few years after the last one, and since I wanted to tell a complete story for the readers, it involved a new threat popping up just when the main characters thought everything was hunky-dory. And I didn't like going more than trilogies because if you're a writer who does your job well, your readers are going to have a connection with your characters. They're going to love them sometimes, at least like them. And it felt to me like going back and torturing people for their whole lives with one thing after another was kind of abusing the emotions that you had engendered for your characters. So I didn't want to do that. So I wanted them to have, a straightforward part of their lives where these things happen, and then they finished up and went to leave a normal life, that was kind of happily ever after, sort of. And I liked reading that sort of story, and I think other people do too. But there are a lot of people, a large audience, that likes cliffhangers, even though they claim they don't, and they like long, continuous series where everything from one book filters into the next and just keeps going. And it's not my preferred way of reading, but since I am a professional, I am not writing for myself anymore. I am writing for the readers. And if the readers want that I'm going to do the best I can to give it to them. So beginning with Recon series, I began to do more of that. I began to have a plan to go forward with the next book. Although the first book could have ended where it ended and you didn't have to read the next one. By the time you get to book 2, you pretty much got to read all the way to book 4 if you want to find out what happens. But I did not really have a detailed outline for books 2, 3, and 4 when I wrote book 1. I still waited till the end of book 1, and then I started thinking about books 2, 3, and 4. And the Acheron series was the next one I wrote, somewhat the same way. I mean, I had an idea for the first story arc of the series. I didn't write it down in detail, but I had an idea of who the bad guy was, the antagonist was, how things were going to wrap up. And they did, mostly. I also had an idea that series would go on for 12 or 15 books, and it did not. It went on for 4 and stopped. And that brings to mind the next part of this. When you start writing series arcs, when you start writing an overarching plot arc that goes from one book to another, you may have this idea, I can do this for 12 books, I can do it for 15 books, but you may not get to write that many. I mean, it's not that anybody's going to stop you, but if you're doing this for money, for a job, and you write the first 3 books and nobody buys them, well, you're probably not going to write the next 12. So, you may think, I'm doing this for the art, and I'm going to put them out anyway because I love them. Well, that's great if you're into this as a hobby, just to write your stories and get them out there. That's one thing. If you really want to be a professional at it, you have to think about what your readers want to read. So you should have, instead of having an open-ended arc that only closes at book 12, you need to have multiple arcs. You have one arc that goes to book 3 or book 4, and then you can jump to the next 3 or 4 books. That way, if you aren't selling and you close it off at book 3 or 4, the readers aren't going to feel like they were cheated. And that's not just an ethical or moral thing that you owe your readers a finish to this story. It's also a marketing thing, because if you write a series that you stop after 3 books and you didn't close off the arc, well, you're doing this because you don't have enough readers. But all those people who did read that series are now, they're not gonna bother with you anymore. You're on their list of writers not to read because you screwed them out of an ending. So you need to, whenever you publish a series, if you publish 1 book of a series, you need to have an ending for that plot arc. And maybe that first book doesn't do well. First books sometimes don't anyway. You get to book 3, put out that first arc, book 3 or 4, get it all up there, and then if it doesn't sell well, then you've done your job, you have serviced your audience, and you will be able to take them along to the next series. And if they email you or message you, as I have been emailed a message saying, where's the next book in this series? I'm like, I don't, and I usually say, I might at some point come back to that universe, but I feel like these characters have gone through enough and they deserve to rest. Because that's how I think of them as people. When you write characters, if you're doing your job and you're also a reader, besides being a writer, you think of the characters as people. You don't want to torture people for their whole lives. I mean, some people do, but the way I feel about it is they've gone through hardships and adventures, and they've lost people and learned things, and now it's the time for them to have a normal life, because also I try to be a little bit realistic, and honestly there's just so much stress and violence that people can take before they break, and I did not want to see that happen to characters I love. So I really only started writing series arcs when I started Wholesale Slaughter. I knew from the beginning it was going to be a 6-book series because I had a contract from Audible to write a 6-book series. And I had only written like 1.5 books in the series, and I had no clear ending for it. I thought about ending it at book 3, but I hadn't really written the series outline. So that was the first series that I went in and I wrote an outline that had multiple arcs that went to book 6. And I think you can see that. I hope you can see it. That I began plot developments in book 1 that, wrapped up in book 6. Like the main character, Logan Brannigan, in that story, he starts off as a young officer who has a very extensive support network. He's got his brother, he's got his father, he's got this general who's the head of intelligence. He's got another general who is the head of his father's armed forces, and they are all this. And he's got this other commando leader officer who is like his father's most trusted officer, who takes care of him the first couple books. And this is all this huge support network he has. And my idea was that as the books went on, that I would strip away this support network, like kick the props out from under him and see if he could stand on his own. And that was the idea to get to book 6. It wasn't just to make him a loner, because he was never a loner, but the idea was to allow him to build his own support network of people he trusted, because he was surrounded by people who had been put in place by his father, by other people, because he was royalty. His father was basically a king, and he had all the support for him, and I wanted him to build up his own followers, his own support system, and I wanted to kick away all these props that other people put in place to help him. And that was pretty much the character arc for the series. And as the series went on, I had started out, his father's king. By the end, I want him to be king. But then as the series went along, and this will happen to you too, characters grow on their own. They don't necessarily go the way you think they're going to go. So Logan Brannigan, by the end, I realized, did not want to be king. He never wanted to be king. He never wanted to be responsible for the minutia, the business dealings, all this. All he wanted to do was be a soldier. So by the end, I'm like, he should be a soldier. You know, he started this wholesale slaughter mercenary unit as an intelligence cover, and then it became real. And I'm thinking at the end, yeah, this is something for him. This is something he started, not something that his father put in motion to allow him to replace him at some point. This is what he wants to do with his life, and this is how the story's going to end. And to me, that's the cool thing about plotting. I mean, some people say, oh, when you outline, you lose the joy of discovery. And I understand that, because when I wrote my first couple books, or 6 books, the most fun thing about seat of the pants discovery writing is when things don't go the way you think they're going to. When you write something and you're like, oh wow, the only thing that makes sense is this, which I had not planned on doing. And people think you lose that. But outlining, if you do it extensively and right, at least in my opinion, the right way, outlining is like writing the first draft. It's like writing the first draft without dialogue, basically. And you can surprise yourself in the outline just as you could when you are writing seat of the pants in a story. And when I got to the outline for book 6 and I reached the end of it and I'm wondering what to do, it was a surprise to me. But, you know, I knew the character well enough that I knew this is what he would do. So I finished Wholesale Slaughter the way I intended to finish it. And people ask me still if I'm going to write more books in Wholesale Slaughter. And again, I get back to the point of I don't really want to torment these characters anymore. But I could write a book that took place later with, you know, their children, their own adventures. But that's something for the future. Once I got through Wholesale Slaughter, then I was committed to, because I signed contracts with different small publishers, and they wanted series, and they wanted a series of a certain length, and I had to write series arcs because I knew this book was coming, and I knew the kind of book that people wanted, so I had to do series arcs. So when you do series arcs, there's a few things you need to take into account. One, in a series, you need, for the most part, an antagonist. Now, there's a few military science fiction series I've written where there's no singular antagonist because the enemy is not human and the main character is not someone who's going to be facing the same alien, you know, military person every time. But there are others where you can, and the antagonist may not ever meet the protagonist. Like in Holy War, the series I'm writing now, there's one protagonist that has a through line in the whole series, all the way to book 4, which I'm still writing, and is on pre-order. And that's this guy who's the war leader for the Tani Emperor. And he goes through his own character arc. At first, he is a loyal, you know, subject, and then as the war goes on, he begins to think maybe I deserve to be the emperor. But then he gets his butt handed to him, and by the end of book 3, he's like, no, I deserve to die for the emperor. And that's where he is at the beginning of book 4. If you're writing something that's more space opera-ish, then you definitely need a main villain that goes through your first series arc. And that's basically how you can plan your arcs too. You can plan them by the villain, by the antagonist. I say villain, but not necessarily a villain, the antagonist. He has to face this antagonist through the first 3 books, then another antagonist through the next 3. You know, and that is a satisfying way to lead your fans along, because if you take care of the villain eventually, but you don't do it in the same book, but you do promise and deliver to take care of the villain and wrap up those plot arcs within 3 or 4 books, then your fans will be satisfied. The readers will be satisfied. They will continue to read you as long as you deliver on what you promise. And what you're promising them is a complete story. I do not like series, and some people do, I do not, where the antagonist just keeps going on and on and on like an old 80s TV show, and they never get killed and they never get defeated permanently, and every episode or book is the same. They go through this plot they have, and the good guys defeat them, and then they escape, and they do it all again next time. Now, some people, you know, think the villain is just as important as the hero, and to some extent I agree. But also, the defeat of the final defeat of the villain is important as well. And that puts more pressure on you as a writer, because you have to come up with a new antagonist who's just as good. But I feel like that's your job. And I feel like reusing the same antagonist for 12 books is cheap. It's lazy. Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody. I don't mean to, but story arcs should wrap up. And maybe you have like a overarching villain, and these other guys are sub-villains, and that can work. You don't have to kill off the uber villain in book 3. He can be behind the scenes, and you may not meet the hero. May not even know that he exists until book 6, you know, or book 4. But eventually, you're going to have to deal with that villain. I mean, you can't keep them there forever. Now, this brings up one of the worst parts of writing long series, and one of the most challenging things as a writer to do in long series is supporting characters. Because the longer your series goes on, the more supporting characters you're going to have, and more people are going to fall in love with each of them. But also the more you're going to have to kill them. And there's a reason for that, is you can't have, 50 supporting characters in a book. Now I say kill them, you might get rid of them some other way, but you can't keep them all. Because people will ask you, where's this guy? Why isn't he in this book? You got to have a reason. So, and also, this sounds a little cheap, but it's true. You have to have consequences. You can't have a series where everybody is getting shot at and blown up and fighting constantly and not have anybody die. Now, it's a choice you have to make as to whether any of the main characters die, but you can't even choose. Side characters are going to die. And if you wrote side characters well enough that people love them, somebody they love is going to die. And as I said, I kind of get attached to my characters, so it's a tough thing. It's hard on me to kill off these side characters, but you have to do it. And I mentioned Wholesale Slaughter before. There was this commando officer named Lita Randell, and she was one of the main character's father's most trusted officers. He sent her along to look after him. She was a font of wisdom, kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi combined with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And eventually she had to go. She had to die. And I didn't want to, because I really loved her character. A lot of people loved her character. They didn't want her to die off. But she had to go. She was the last of the supporting props that his father put in place, so she had to go. My series Earth at War, I do this in the first book. I created a side character that everybody who read it loved, and he dies at the end of the first book. And I hated doing it because by the end of the first book, I had come to love him too. He was just somebody I created off the cuff, just for a pun on his name. Delta Force, CAG, whatever you want to call him, operator, master sergeant named James Bowie. And his friends, as a joke, called him Jambo, like Rambo. And he was just somebody who was there to explain things from a military point of view. But he became the best friend and the confidant and the supporter and the trainer and teacher of the main character. And I knew, and that was his death sentence, because by the end of the first book, I knew this guy's around. The main character is never going to step up and become a leader, because this guy's the leader. He's the one everybody looks to. And the main character, Andy, if Andy is there and Jambo is there, all the people in that Delta Force team are looking to Jambo. If there comes a time where they have to go do some mission, Andy might go along, but they're going to assign it to Jambo. And I'm like, I need my main character to be the main character, to be a decisive character. So Jambo's got to go. And I hated doing it. And a lot of people read the book were like, oh, how could you kill him off? But I had to. And when you write a long series, you're going to have multiple characters like that. You're going to have multiple characters that people love who get killed off. And that's another thing I don't really like about writing long series. But if you want to succeed in this business, if you want people to buy your books and follow you, they expect long series. They expect lots of supporting characters, and even though they claim to not like it, they know some of them are going to die. And I don't like killing them off, but you have to. And you also owe it to the character and to the reader to make sure you kill them in a meaningful way. Not always. I mean, there's a few times where they've died without preamble, just to show the sudden and unfair nature of combat. But usually their death means something. And for their death to mean something, what that means is, besides the character arc for the main characters in the series, besides the villain arc for the villain, you're going to have a character arc for these side characters. And you may have to plan it out ahead of time. Sometimes it'll come to you naturally. But you're going to have a plan. If I'm killing them in book 3, and that death's supposed to mean something, they have to have changed as a person from book 1 to book 3. They have to have evolved. They have to come to mean a lot to the main character and a lot to the audience. Like in Drop Trooper. Spoilers if you haven't read it. By the way, there's a character in book 1 named Wade Cunningham. He's in Butthole. He's like an antagonist for the main character. But by the end of the book, they have made peace with each other. It's part of the main character's growth as a person, as a leader, that he knows he has to make peace with people like that and not, because there is a fellow Marine and he has to, deal with him and work with him. He kind of disappears a bit through books 2 and 3, or 2, 3, and 4. But then in book 5, he comes back, and he's in a new role. He's working for a different, he's not a Marine anymore, but he introduces Cam, the main character, to this new plot arc. Now, when I put him in there, I didn't know what I was going to eventually do with him. But as it turned out, as each book went on, he went through more and more things. And he was a lost soul, because once he got out of the Marines, he really didn't know what he was going to do with himself. And he didn't have any other purpose besides being Marine. What he was a cautionary tale for the main character, because Cam is at a point where he doesn't know what he is if he isn't a Marine. If he's not working, he's not fighting as a Marine, he doesn't know what he's good for. So this was, the death of Wade Cunningham was a cautionary tale for the main character. Wade eventually comes to terms with the fact that he can't do this forever. And Cam tells him, there's other things you can do that you could enjoy in life. And Wade doesn't seem convinced. And Wade dies in battle and doesn't seem too unhappy about it. So Cam is left with the realization, is this my future? Am I just going to keep doing this until I die? Can I not have a life with my wife? Can we not have kids and live somewhere and have a business and have a normal life? Is this what I have to do for the rest of my life until I die? And that's an important realization for him in book 7? Or is it 8? 8, book 8, which is the end of the second arc. So I had to build Wade Cunningham up through books 4 through 8, so that when he dies in book 8, his death will mean something both to the readers and to the main characters. So that's something else to keep in mind, that supporting characters have to have an arc. You don't have to kill them, not always. You can have them be the one that decides, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to go, have a normal life. That's up to you how you want to deal with it. But they can't be there forever. You can have a few side characters there forever, but eventually you're going to have to deal with getting rid of some of them. Okay, and finally, the last thing you have to plot out in a series arc, when you're plotting out 3 or 4 books at a time, is the stakes. What is the prize at the end of this? Now, some people don't, a lot of people don't do this. But I think that in every long, even a long series, there has to be a payoff. There has to be an ending. I mean, Drop Trooper sells really well, and I'm probably going to do 12 books in it, but I'm not going to write it forever, despite what my publishers think. I'm going to wrap it up. And when I wrap it up, I need to know what the end is for the characters. What goal are they working towards? What is the final payoff? And you need to know that too. You may not share it with the audience, and you may never get to share it with the audience, because, as I say, not all series succeed. But you need to have it in mind so that when the time comes, if you've done your job and they've been reading this whole time, that there's a satisfying ending for them. In Duty, Honor, Planet, the trilogy, at the end, the main character is actually going to be president of the Republic, and he's married to his the woman he loves, and they're talking about having kids, and other people have had their payoff in the end, and his replacement is in line for his old job. And I wrapped all of that up, and for a series that I did not plan out ahead of time, I think I wrapped it up pretty well. And you need to have a payoff that your readers will appreciate. Not everybody has to live happily ever after. Not everybody has to live, period. But if you want your readers to come back to you and trust you, then you have to have a payoff that is satisfying for them. So that's something, if you're planning a long series, you have to keep that in mind, because if it ends sooner than you thought, if you meant it to go 6 books and it goes 3, if you meant it to go 9 books and it goes 6, that last book that you write has to have a payoff. So you may wind up having to have multiple satisfying conclusions. But you cannot end a series arc, a book arc, for book 3 or book 6 or book 9. You can't end that without a payoff that satisfies your readers. Yeah, okay, that's going to be it for today. I'm going to try to do more of these, moving and writing permitting, and I hope that you guys are still watching. And I hope you have a good day. Remember, you can reach me at dutyhonorplanet487@gmail.com. or look up my Facebook author page at facebook.com/dutyhonorplanet. Thank you.